Wow, this is a compliant crowd. She said sit down and everybody sat and got silent. Well done. I'm Jennifer King Rice, the Dean of the College of Education, and I am just absolutely delighted to welcome you to the inaugural College of Education Dean's Lecture Series on Education and Society. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to extend a special welcome to President Lowe, Provost Rankin, Dr. King, and our many distinguished guests, including members of the University Board of Trustees and the college's Board of Visitors. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that tonight's program will be taped, so we do have a video camera going, and I wanted to make you all aware of that. I'd like to begin by saying just a few words about this lecture series and its significance. Reflecting the mission of our College of Education, the Dean's Lecture on Education and Society brings together scholars, leaders, students, educators, public intellectuals, community members, all of us, to discuss some of the most pressing and contested issues in society and to consider how education might help to address them. Our college has a long-standing commitment to realizing the transformative power of teaching and learning, of schools and school systems and higher education. We seek to improve the world through our research that explores early childhood education all the way up through lifelong learning, our academic programs that train educators and leaders to prepare the next generation of global citizens, our advocacy for policy reform, and our community service to the state of Maryland and to our surrounding counties. The Dean's Lecture Series is just one more effort to promote positive change in education and in society. The framing of this series was intentionally broad. I grappled with this for a long time, how narrow, how broad. But I settled on broad, education and society, to recognize the fundamental role that education plays in realizing the very broad social, civic, and economic goals of our society. In fact, public schools were founded centuries ago to develop citizens who could participate in our democratic and civic institutions. Of course, that was way before standardized testing and high-stakes accountability policies narrowed our curriculum and in many respects narrowed the perceived perceptions of the purposes of public education. But that broad commitment is really at the core of public education. And the public investment in public education at both the K-12 and the higher education levels reflects social values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Education plays an essential role in improving the opportunities, the outcomes, and the full participation of all individuals. So tonight, with our inaugural lecture, we begin a conversation with you, our colleagues, faculty, students, alumni, and friends about critical issues facing education and our society. We are honored to have with us tonight Dr. John B. King, Jr., President and CEO of the Education Trust and former U.S. Secretary of Education, leading our discussion on the topic of advancing the civic mission of higher education in challenging times. Tonight's lecture is motivated by so many current issues and events. All you need to do is flip on the evening news to see them. These events signal a need for greater civic education and engagement. Engagement that's fueled by civil discourse and informed by an understanding of democratic processes and values. This lecture also reflects a recognition of the power and the promise of education to help deliver, develop, and promote the knowledge, skills, dispositions, and values needed to participate in our diverse democracy. The topic of civic education is evident in many facets of the work we do in the College of Education. Through our research, we're exploring inclusion in a diverse society, new pedagogy in civic education, and leadership development that focuses on the foundational values of our society. Through teaching, we're training our students to create inclusive learning environments and to facilitate intergroup dialogues among diverse perspectives. And we're empowering our students to be engaged in the important issues facing our society today. And lastly, as a partner with school systems throughout the state, we're helping to shape school reform and policy that meets the needs of all individuals. This lecture series would not be possible without the critical support of some very important people. We have been humbled and honored by the generous philanthropic support of the Claravit family over the years. They have provided us with the financial support to make this lecture series a reality. So I want to thank Allie Claravit, who earned her undergraduate degree from us in 2013 and her master's degree in 2014, and she's currently a member of our Board of Visitors. Allie's mother, Nancy Claravit, class of 1978 and member of the University Board of Trustees, and Allie's father, Chuck, and brother, Sam. We are grateful to the Claravit family for their support. Another individual who's been instrumental in tonight's launch has been President Wallace Lowe. President Lowe and I have discussed this lecture since I first became dean in the fall, and he's helped to shape its purpose over time. Dr. Lowe has been a transformative leader of the university, and I am confident that his attention to issues of civic education and engagement will reinforce the broad social goals of higher education and will help to shape our efforts to realize those goals here at the University of Maryland. So I would like to ask President Lowe to now come to the podium and share his thoughts on tonight's topic.
Thank you to our new dean, Jennifer, and thank you all for coming to this first inaugural lecture series in education and critical issues in society. And of course, I want to welcome our very special guest. He will be formally introduced in a moment, but somebody who exemplifies all the best in the values of this country, of his commitment to service, somebody who believes deeply that education is the great equalizer of conditions in a society, that's passport for social and economic opportunity, and in his present role and in his previous role, he works strenuously to advance excellence and equity and inclusion through education. So thank you very much for being our speaker today. I am very much looking forward to your remarks about the mission of a university to advance civic education in challenging times. We do a very good job at this university in equipping students with the knowledge and skills to be productive citizens and be gainfully employed. I'm not so sure that we're living up to our educational mission to also produce citizens and leaders who know how to live rightly in a free society. You say these are challenging times. These are indeed fraught times. During my adult years, I don't think there's been a period as divided and polarized by race, by immigration, by politics, as we have today. And as Abraham Lincoln once said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. This is not just about differences on these issues. This fraught period is a fight for the heart and soul of American democracy. At a time of a rising populist, nationalist ideology in this country and around the world, led by people who, in my opinion, have neither heart nor soul. It is deeply troubling to me that democracy, that the hardware of democracy, which is the electoral process, is being undermined from abroad by interference in our elections. But it is also undermined from within by the fact that millennials constitute over 1/3 of the population, and less than one have voted at the last presidential election. And that hardware is driven by software, the software of democracy. which are the fundamental enumerated freedoms that we enjoy as citizens: freedom of expression, freedom of worship, of equality and fairness that are enshrined in the Constitution. And somehow, these values are not fully being lived out. They are not being lived out in the practical skills of citizenship, how to listen to people with different views without demonizing them, how to come together and try to find common ground without sacrificing the high ground. These are the skills of democracy that are being undermined, that we need to inculcate, not just among college students, but starting in K-12 education. And so let me just conclude with one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass, when also at a very polarized time in our nation, shortly after the Civil War, he gave this famous oration called A Composite Nation, and that was the language for a multicultural, multiracial nation, using the language of the late 19th century. He said, in this composite nation of ours, there should be, under law, no high, no low, no white, no black, but only a common country, a common citizenship, and a common destiny. He was articulating a vision of Americanism, of American identity, that is a form of enlightened patriotism, a civic nationalism rooted in the values of this country. And for 242 years, we've been trying to fully live up to those values. We've progressed a long ways, but we have a long ways still to go. But unless we have a reaffirmation and understanding of those values that define us as citizens, because other countries are defined by race, by nationality, by ethnicity, by religion, but being an American is a matter of the heart. It's a commitment of our state of mind to those values that have attracted millions of immigrants in the past to this country and make us a beacon of liberty and freedom throughout the world. Those are the values that we need to educate more than ever today, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentation of Dr. King. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Lowe. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. John B. King, Jr. is the President and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. Dr. King served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. Dr. King began his career in education as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and Boston, Massachusetts, and then as a middle school principal. He is the son of educators. It's in his blood, I guess you could say. Dr. King holds a Bachelor of Arts in Government from Harvard University, a JD from Yale Law School, as well as a Master of Arts in the teaching of social studies and a doctorate in education from Teachers College at Columbia University. I have had the pleasure of working with John since he started as a visiting professor in the College of Education in the fall of 2017. He inspires our undergraduates across campus in his class, Controversial Issues in Education Reform. And based on his political background, I think John may know a thing or two about controversial issues. Please join me in welcoming John King.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, President Lowe and Dean Rice, for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak tonight. Thank you to the University of Maryland community for joining us this evening. I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk with you about a subject about which I care very deeply. As a former social studies teacher, as a visiting professor here at the university, and as an American. Today I want to talk about the relationship between education and democracy. I want to challenge our nation's colleges and universities, including this very community, to renew their civic missions and to take even greater responsibility for educating students to become informed and engaged citizens who are prepared to contribute to our society and to help solve the most pressing challenges facing our communities and our world today. These are indeed, as President Lowe described, challenging and fraught times. We see conflict and divisive politics in America and around the globe. We see disparities in opportunity that in our nation are so often drawn along lines of race, class, and gender. We see frustration directed at the other, which focuses blame on immigrants, those who practice a different faith or those of a different ethnic background. We see our country's ongoing struggle with issues of race and bias, all too often in the interactions between communities and police, which all too often result in needless deaths. We see domestic terrorism, like we saw on the campus of the University of Virginia. And we hear rhetoric that targets people because of their religion, because of their race, because of their LGBTQ status, because of their family's country of origin. Indeed, hate crimes are up in levels that we have not seen in recent history, and we know that a growing number of American communities are increasingly segregated by race and class. In many ways, this is a moment where it seems the United States is not living up to its promise of equality and opportunity. But I believe deeply, as I ever have, that even in times of discord, America is resilient. America is hope. One of the reasons that I'm optimistic is because of young people, the young people who are gathered here in this room for the topic of civic learning and engagement. But I'm also optimistic because of the hundreds of thousands of young people across the country who were recently motivated to make their voices heard on issues they care about by participating in school walkouts and rallies, including my daughters. I'm optimistic because of the young people of Parkland, Florida, who after surviving a tragic shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, leverage social media to create the #NeverAgain movement and organize the March for Our Lives protest marches, one of the largest student-led protests we've seen in the country since the Vietnam War. These students are driving important national dialogue about issues of guns, gun violence, and mental health. The students from Stoneman Douglas are poised and outspoken activists, but that is no accident. Their words and actions are informed and powerful precisely because of the well-rounded education they received at Stoneman Douglas, which in many ways emphasize the very knowledge and skills that are necessary for effective civic engagement. The education they received is one that provides learning about political activism, about free speech, about American history and government. It's an education that includes, because of a district-wide commitment to require civic education in middle school and high school, a public speaking program that teaches the skills of speech making and debate. It's an education that is rich in extracurricular offerings like theater and arts and the world languages and sciences. It's an education that includes exceptional programs in journalism, which prepared the Stoneman Douglas students, in the words of Christy Ma, editor of the school newspaper, to show the world what was going on and why we need change. Unfortunately, not all of the students in our nation's K-12 schools or colleges have access to the kind of rich education that includes robust civic engagement. Maryland is, in fact, the only state in the company of the District of Columbia that requires both civics courses and community service for high school graduation. Just 8 states require that high school students pass a test in civics to earn their diploma. And according to a recent analysis by the Center for American Progress, no state in the nation, not one, currently provides students with a comprehensive K-12 civic education. It's not surprising then that only about 1 in 5 students in the 8th and 12th grades has a working knowledge of the Constitution, the presidency, Congress, the courts, and how laws are made. And as all too often happens in our country, we are failing our low-income students and students of color at a higher rate. In fact, only about 1 in 10 African American, Hispanic, and low-income students have a working knowledge of how government functions. When the majority of students in our nation's public elementary and secondary schools are now students of color and low-income students, if we continue to fail these children, our nation has no future. Our economy and our democracy have no future. The post-secondary level, few colleges have an explicit civics program or require students to take courses that are purposefully designed to prepare them for civic responsibilities. Indeed, large numbers of undergraduate students never complete a single course in economics or American politics or government. Few students outside of those intending to earn a degree in these or related fields take a course in political philosophy or international affairs. And while most colleges report that a majority of their students engage in some form of community service, less than half of participating undergraduates can link their community service activities with a course or a program that asks them to draw connections between their service and issues of public policy. Students' experience in school from kindergarten through college impacts their civic understanding as adults. It's worrisome that only 26% of Americans, when surveyed, can name all 3 branches of government, and that nearly 40% of Americans cannot identify any of the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. Students' experiences in school also impact the civic actions in which they engage as adults. As President Lowe referenced, the voter participation has reached its lowest point in nearly 2 decades, and despite a small uptick in youth voting in the last election, this is deeply troubling. In fact, in 2016, the U.S. ranked 28th out of 35 Western democracies in voter turnout. When we think about the responsibilities of good citizens, we often think primarily about voting, and I want to pause on that for just a moment. Voting is unquestionably the cornerstone of freedom. The right to vote undergirds all of our other rights. And throughout our history, people have fought and died to be treated as full citizens and able to cast a ballot. It's important for us to remember that it was more than 130 years after the ratification of the Constitution before women in this country were allowed to vote through the passage of the 19th Amendment. It's also important to remember that it wasn't until 1965 and passage of the Voting Rights Act that African Americans were finally guaranteed a place at the ballot box, even though 100 years earlier the 15th Amendment had prohibited federal and state governments from denying citizens the right to vote based on race. This is an ancient history. Consider that all throughout the United States, you can find African American voters today who can still remember the sting of having to pass a literacy test before being allowed to register and vote. We need to continue to be vigilant to ensure that the right to vote is protected. But voting alone, although critically important, is not the whole of our responsibility as citizens in a strong democracy. Indeed, the strength of our democracy depends on all of us as good citizens, understanding our history and the Constitution and how government works at every level. It depends on our willingness to march in the streets and to exercise our right to protest, just as so many young people did in recent weeks. But our democracy depends even on more than that. It's not just about hashtags. It depends on more than voicing outrage at some injustice on social media. The Parkland students are an example of not just using social media to convey an idea or a concern or a request for a change in policy, they're taking their activism from online to offline by advocating in the streets and in town halls. The fact is, all of us are and must be democracy builders. No matter our zip code, no matter our race, no matter where we worship or whether we worship, no matter how much money we make. And as I'll describe in a few moments, institutions of higher education like the University of Maryland and colleges throughout the country have a vital role to play in preparing graduates not only for good jobs and fulfilling lives, but for what should be one of the most active and important roles in their lives, the role of citizen. We build our democracy when we become informed and thoughtful about national, state, and local issues, and when we stand up for our rights by sitting down at community meetings and engaging with our neighbors. We build our democracy when we get involved in solving problems both inside and beyond our own cities and towns, and when we join campaigns and run for office ourselves. And we build our democracy when we think beyond our own needs and wants and embrace our obligations to the greater good. Preparing Americans for their role as citizen, in fact, long has been a central mission of education in this country and was described by the founders. In the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson wrote how education must prepare students to, quote, understand their duties to their neighbors and country, and to know their rights, and to exercise with order and justice those rights they retain. History also teaches us that our society continually has turned to higher education to instill and advance democratic ideals and practices. It happened in the midst of the Civil War when President Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, establishing the grants of land so that states could finance institutions of higher education. Indeed, the University of Maryland is in fact one of those early land grant colleges. It also happened in the era following World War II when returning soldiers headed to colleges and universities so they could make better lives for themselves, their families, and their communities with the help of the GI Bill. And it happened in 1947 when President Truman's Commission on Higher Education released a seminal report calling for states to create a system of community colleges that could educate the large masses of veterans coming home from abroad. It's important to note that Truman's Commission didn't just issue their call for the creation of community colleges in economic terms. The Commission stated, in fact, that the first and foremost charge upon higher education is that all levels and in all fields of specialization, it shall be the carrier of democratic values, ideals, and processes. Even today, more than 70 years later, a call to reinvigorate the civic mission of higher education is not in conflict with the work that colleges are doing to ensure students graduate and to prepare them for success in the workplace. Indeed, there is much encouraging research that shows students who are provided with robust civic learning opportunities are more likely to complete college on time. And the skills and capacities that people need to thrive in the workplace are not different from those they need to succeed in our diverse democratic society as citizens. Skills like critical thinking and problem solving, bridge building across areas of difference, effective listening and communication, collaborative decision making, and teamwork. In 1948, while a 19-year-old student at Morehouse College, Martin Luther King Jr. penned a powerful and still relevant reflection on the purpose of education directed particularly at colleges. Given that just this past week we marked the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, it's important to reflect on the power of his words and legacy, and perhaps humbling for all of us that that powerful legacy begins with an essay he wrote for the Maroon Tiger while at Morehouse as a 19-year-old. I wish for every student here that their writing at 19 should be quoted in a speech many, many years hence. Now, Dr. King wrote in that powerful essay on the purpose of education that the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. King continued, we must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The complete education gives one not only power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. He wrote in that essay about the then governor of Georgia. And he talked about the governor of Georgia, and he said, you know, he has many academic accomplishments. Indeed, he's a Phi Beta Kappa. But he also believes in my inferiority as a human being. And he asked his classmates, his university, all of us, can one be truly educated if those are one's values? And so civic education isn't just about knowledge and skills. It is also about values. It's about a commitment to our democracy. Now, there are those who say that elevating the civic mission of higher education should not be pursued because they see it as a purely partisan political goal. To these critics, I say that as institutions that operate in and depend upon democratic society for their existence, colleges absolutely should make it part of their primary mission to equip students to be knowledgeable, active citizens who can build up the health of that very democratic society. This goal doesn't presuppose any specific political end. It makes our nation stronger, and it actually serves to advance the enlightened self-interest of higher education itself. Quality civic learning, which digs into challenging issues and instills in students democratic knowledge and skills, and the inclination to serve, works. It equips students for demanding careers and to help our country solve difficult and complex issues. Indeed, research compiled by the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools shows that students who receive civic education are more likely to vote, they are 4 times more likely to volunteer and work on community issues, and they are more confident in their ability to speak publicly and communicate with elected officials. So what will it take? What will it take for colleges and universities to reclaim their civic purpose? A good place to start is by making civic learning an expected part of every student's post-secondary educational experience. In fact, that was the main recommendation of a 2012 federal report commissioned by the Obama administration and issued by the American Association of Colleges and Universities and other groups. The report urged colleges to make civic learning and democratic engagement an animating national priority. And it's important to note that since that report in 2012, there has been progress. There are institutions that have committed to this work. I think about the work at Wake Forest, where they established a task force to identify areas of institutional strength and weakness across civic ethos, literacy, inquiry, and action. I think about Kingsborough Community College in New York, which developed a 2-part civic engagement requirement for graduation that could be fulfilled through coursework and activities within student life. Clearly, there's good work happening on campuses around the country, but there is much, much more to do. And I want to suggest today 3 areas where universities, including this one, should focus. First, focus on developing students' civic knowledge by making civic learning pervasive throughout the college experience. There are practical steps that institutions can take to integrate civic learning into the existing curricula. For example, faculty can include exercises that require students to reflect on the connection between course topics and public policy or a local problem that needs solving. The Center for Public Deliberation at the University of Houston downtown, for example, has helped the school to infuse discussions about complex social and political issues into courses such as ethical decision-making and critical race studies. And through Project Pericles, a consortium of more than 30 colleges have introduced about 100 civic courses into their curricula in recent years. The consortium encourages colleges to examine their civic offerings, to determine additional needs by comparing their curricula to peer institutions, and to then develop new courses that will address civic learning. Students, whether they're preparing for careers in business, science, theater, the trades, arts, or education, all need to develop an understanding of the kinds of civic dilemmas and questions with which professionals in every field invariably grapple. Civic education can't just be for the civics course, can't just be for the American history and government course. Civics has to be a part of how we think about our work across disciplines. Whether a student's being prepared to be an engineer or to be a chemist, think about the societal consequences of the rapid advances we are making in genetic science. Those are civic questions that we have to prepare students to engage with. Think about the future doctor, and then think about our nation's struggle to ensure access to quality health care for all our citizens. These are civic education questions in which doctors must be prepared to engage. I would also argue that colleges like this one that train teachers, especially elementary school teachers, must require more than just cursory learning in social studies as part of their educator preparation programs. Indeed, the reality across the country is that too often social studies is given short shrift in elementary school classrooms. For example, a recent survey found that more than 80% of elementary teachers reported that extra time devoted to math or English language arts has meant less time for other subjects. According to the National Survey of Science and Mathematics Education, the total time spent in grades K through 3 on both science and social studies dropped by 45 minutes per week from 2000 to 2012. Indeed, the survey revealed that on average, just 16 minutes of classroom time per day is devoted to social studies in those grades. We must acknowledge that one of the reasons that this happens is that some districts and schools have responded to accountability for English language arts and math by reducing the time spent on science, on the arts, and on social studies. But this is, of course, exactly backwards. The tragedy is the pedagogical mistake to suggest that the way to help a student read more is for them to have less background knowledge, less vocabulary. It's exactly the opposite. Right? We know that, of course, when you start to read, decoding words is critical, but once you are able to fluently decode, the key to comprehending text is the quality of your vocabulary and the depth of your background knowledge. We must ensure that future teachers understand the centrality of knowledge building to student success as readers, their long-term academic success, and their preparation for citizenship. Speaking of teachers, if institutions of higher education are to make civic knowledge a priority for students, they also have to recognize civic learning as an important area of investigation and study and scholarship for faculty members across disciplines. The second key area in which higher education institutions can advance their civic mission is in developing students' civic skills, civic knowledge, and then civic skills. Students should have the opportunity to do democracy, what some refer to as action civics, by getting involved in actual campus and community issues. Many colleges connect student learning with practice by incorporating fieldwork or case studies into curricula. Service learning is another important way in which students can apply their knowledge to real-world scenarios. At Tufts University, for example, in an environmental engineering course, students have learned about hazardous waste by analyzing data from contaminated sites in Boston. The students then developed systems that the city could use to clean up those sites. Research shows that linking service activities with coursework goes further to encourage students to engage in civic activities after they graduate than just community service alone. And while more than 70% of all college students across the country participate in some form of service learning or volunteer work, only half of college students participate in credit-bearing service learning while in school. Colleges can do more to consider the incentives they provide for service. They can do more to offer opportunities for students to earn credit in service learning, and they can do more to lift up the prestige of service learning on campus. Rutgers University at Newark, for example, has established an honors living and learning community that encourages students to tackle pressing issues affecting the campus, the city of Newark, and the nation. So this selective program seeks out talented undergraduates from various backgrounds, including, importantly, first-generation students, veterans, and student parents, who all live together in a designated intergenerational residence hall and collaborate with faculty and community partners to work on issues of their choice. There is, of course, the Civic program here at University of Maryland that has similar features in terms of its emphasis on citizenship, student leadership, community service, and scholarship. Studies show that service learning directly correlates with greater academic outcomes as well as improved college completion. Indeed, I've often argued that we should require national service of all young people in the United States. Right? Imagine the difference, that's right, imagine the difference it would make. Think about the experience that young people would have working across lines of race and class if we required of all students some degree of national service. It could be in the military, it could be in a service opportunity like City Year, it could be working in schools, supporting teachers, it could be working to address the damage we've done to our environment. Now, for me, this notion of service learning is deeply personal. I began my career, one of the reasons I became a teacher and a principal was because of the experience of doing service learning. When I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, something President Lowe and I have in common. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but I started doing volunteer work, teaching civics in Boston public schools. And then I got involved in an after-school program in the Mission Hill community in Roxbury. And then I got involved in a summer program in that same community. And having been a kid who grew up in New York City and whose life was saved by New York City public school teachers, I found that the experience of trying to do for other kids what teachers had done for me was deeply satisfying. And changed my career plan, and I became a teacher and a principal in the very same community where I was doing that volunteer work as an undergraduate. And I could recall in my relationship with my students in Mission Hill, the experiences I had with amazing New York City public school teachers. My mom passed away when I was 8. My dad when I was 12. I'm alive today because of the difference that New York City public school teachers made in my life, because they made school a place that was engaging and compelling and interesting and safe, a place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid outside of school. And when I had the privilege of doing that for other young people, it changed my vision of what I wanted to do for my career. In fact, the community where I worked then, Mission Maine Housing Project, was then the largest open-air crack market in New England. It was a community rife with crime and drugs and violence, but I also saw that it was a community rich with hope and resiliency and tenacity. And that experience, being a part of that community, changed my life and my direction. That's what service learning can be for young people. Now, beyond the work of engaging students in the community, it also matters the kind of community that universities create. Indeed, the work that colleges do to create a student body that represents people of varying socioeconomic backgrounds, race, religion, LGBTQ status, and political orientation also helps students gain the vital skills necessary for participation in democracy. Students' experience of diversity on campus can expose them to different perspectives, different cultures, can help prepare them for a diverse workplace and to engage in the diverse community of American political life. But the reality is that our higher education institutions have very far to go on this front of ensuring communities that on our higher education campuses that reflect the diversity we value. Consider the reality that in public flagship universities across the country, only about 5% of students are African American, only about 8% are Latino. Consider a recent study of 38 selective colleges, including 5 in the Ivy League, that showed more students came from families in the top 1% of income than from the entire bottom 60%. Now, we have a long way to go to ensure that students' experience on campus reflects the diversity of American life. Now, I know this is an area of focus for the University of Maryland, and I'm hopeful, as I know many of us are, that the Center on Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education here at the University of Maryland can play a role in leading other institutions across the country to reflect on the research, to reflect on their practice and approach so that we can make progress towards greater equity and diversity. Now, I want to take a moment to say that in addition to the skills that come with service learning and the kind of diverse campus environment we aspire to, we also have to acknowledge, and perhaps particularly appropriate today given the testimony in Congress today, we have to acknowledge that technology is powerfully changing the landscape of civic discourse. Indeed, colleges have an increased obligation to prepare students to be savvy, critical consumers of news and information, and to navigate the online discussions that can often devolve into being insulting or stifling. Recent research from the Omidyar Group found that while social media networks provide value to civic life through immediate communication and connections, they do pose dangers. Some of these include, and we've seen this in recent times without question, the rapid spread of misinformation, increased polarization of our society via the creation of echo chambers, where folks can block out all contrarian views and information and only listen to and talk with people who have the very same views that they do. Now, college students aren't unaware of these issues. In a recent poll, 2 out of 3 college students said that platforms such as Twitter and Facebook should take responsibility to limit hate speech, to shape a dialogue that is more civil. But we also know that we can aspire to more than just reducing the presence of hate. We can aspire to making social media truly a tool for social organizing. Think about it, Emma Gonzalez, one of the Parkland students, who now has not only more followers on Twitter than the NRA. I believe she's now at double the number of followers of the NRA on Twitter. Right? So social media can be this powerful megaphone, but it has to be something that we prepare our young people for. In fact, in that same essay that Dr. King wrote in 1948, he wrote about the idea that one of the ways in which you could produce intelligence plus character was an education that prepared young people to discern between fact and fiction, right? To sift through propaganda. It's quite a prescient essay that he wrote. Third, in the final category of work I want to talk about is civic action. So there's civic knowledge, there's civic skills, and then there's doing things. Now, there's a long tradition of college campuses being a place of civic action. I think about the North Carolina A&T students who inspired young people and adults all across the country during the height of the civil rights movement through their peaceful protests against segregation by integrating white-only lunch counters. I think about the students in the 1970s and 1980s who organized to demand that their campuses divest from South Africa to oppose apartheid. I think about, more recently, the grassroots movement that launched at UCLA around student hunger. Indeed, we know on many college campuses, hunger and food insecurity are a substantial issue. A recent survey showed Among the students surveyed, as high as 36% of students experience some degree of food insecurity on campus. Now, a group of students at UCLA saw that, and they took civic action. They realized that there were students who weren't using all of the meals on their meal card. And so they organized a campaign called Swipe Out Hunger, where students can contribute their unused meal card points to their classmates who are experiencing hunger and food insecurity. There are countless students on campuses all across the country involved in student government associations who are playing important leadership roles in their communities. There's also the work of ensuring that students have the opportunity to vote, that they understand how to register to vote, understand where they can vote, understand how to register at home if they choose, or to register on campus. There's an effort called the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge, of which Maryland is a part, which is a national collaboration amongst higher education institutions committed to ensuring that their students have access to voting and participate as voters. Indeed, Maryland was recently recognized as a Silver Seal campus for its high voter participation rates. But there's more to do to ensure that all students are active participants as voters, that they see Election Day as a moment of action, but also that they participate in campaigns, regardless of party, regardless of their preferences around the political outcomes they seek. All students should understand the political process and should look for opportunities to participate in campaigns. Indeed, if you think about all of the students on the University of Maryland campuses, not just here, but across the state, think about the power to influence public policy. Ultimately, civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic action are all about how we respond to these challenging times, to this difficult moment for the country that President Lowe talked about. Last week, I was in Memphis at the National Civil Rights Museum because, again, of the 50th, marking 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King. That museum, if you haven't been there, you should go. It's a powerful experience. The museum is in the Lorraine Motel, the very building where Dr. King was assassinated. You could stand in the room where Dr. King stayed. The museum powerfully tells the story of the civil rights movement. But when we think about what it means to mark 50 years since Dr. King's assassination, yes, it is a moment for reflection. It's a moment to tell the historical story of what happened then, of how he lived and served. It is a moment to reflect on the progress we have yet to make as a country 50 years later, the degree to which the causes to which he dedicated his life and for which he gave his life remain still unfulfilled. Dr. King would have articulated his mission around combating racism and poverty and war. As Dean Rice said, you don't have to look beyond today's paper or tonight's news broadcast to see that we have much more work to do to advance that struggle against the forces of racism, poverty, and war. But I want to suggest that as we mark that 50th anniversary, reflection is not enough. Necessary but not sufficient. The real call is to action. The real question for all of us, why this civic moment matters so much, is that we face these huge challenges to our democracy, to notions of equality, to the civil rights of our fellow citizens, of our fellow human beings. Right? Dr. King would have called us to act, to stand up. For many of us who are too young to have participated in the civil rights movement, we may have reflected, where would we have been? What would we have done? Would we have ridden on the Freedom Rides? Would we have marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma? Well, I want to suggest that ultimately, civic education, civic engagement in challenging times is about the question not what would we have done then, but what will we do now? What will each of us do to advance the cause of a more just society? What will each of us do to stand up to defend our democracy? What will each of us do to ensure the humanity of our society, the dignity in which our fellow human beings are able to live their lives? What will we do today? What action will we take? So, I believe universities have a unique responsibility here. But that is because they are institutions that reflect all of our unique moral responsibility to make our society better. That's what we should be reflecting on. That is how we should choose what we do tomorrow. So this speech, as much as it's about higher education, as much as it's about civic education, is about a call for all of us to reflect on the justice we seek and then to act. Let me close with this. Benjamin Franklin once wrote, "An ability to serve mankind, one's country, friends, and family should be the great aim and end of all learning." That is the charge of America's colleges and universities. That is our charge tonight. Thanks so much. So, if I haven't gone on too long, as sometimes social studies teachers are wont to do, I believe we have time for discussion, questions. We have 2 microphones. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. King, my name is Mark Ginsberg. I'm in the International Education Policy program. I've recently been inspired as well by the civic action at another university in the region, Howard University, where students inspired and educated by the previous experiences of their fellow students in '68 and '79 decided things had got to a point they had to move beyond just talk. And I wonder if you wanted to comment on the actions at what turns out to be the alma mater of Stokely Carmichael.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and at the law school, Thurgood Marshall, right? Two things. One is I am always encouraged and impressed when young people figure out how to, through nonviolence, communicate their concerns and demand change. And I think the agenda of the students protesting at Howard is a powerful one and a fairly simple ask, right? That one should be able to go to college knowing that you're going to be able to have decent housing, that you're going to have adequate financial support to not only start your education, but complete your education. That said, I also want to say this is more than just a Howard University issue. That we're at this incredible moment in our country, I think, which is about choosing who do we want to be as a country. Right? My belief is if you are a young person growing up in the United States of America, you ought to have confidence that you can get a higher education that is affordable to you. And yet we can't promise that today because we've chosen to invest our resources elsewhere. President Obama proposed to Congress that we invest $61 billion over 10 years to guarantee at least the first 2 years of college, 2 years of community college for all students, for all low-income and middle-income students. $61 billion over 10 years. So my job was to go talk to members of Congress about that $61 billion. And what I heard from people time and again was, oh, that's too expensive. Oh, we couldn't afford that. Those very same members of Congress have just sent trillions of dollars to the wealthiest 1% in the United States. That's a values choice. Vice President Biden always said, don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget and I'll know what your values are. right? That's a value choice. So the students at Howard, I think, reflect a demand of their generation, which is we ought to be able to get a higher education at a reasonable cost that is affordable and pursue our dreams and ambitions. That strikes me as a very reasonable ask. Thanks for the question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. My name's Jennifer Burris, and I'm a PhD student here, but I'm also a former educator from Oklahoma. And right now you know that we're in the midst of teacher walkouts, and you said that you were optimistic about our current walkouts. However, today the Washington Post reported that Secretary DeVos commented, quote, "We should keep adult disputes in a separate place." So I want to know, what do you think that the role of democracy and civic education should be during the teacher walkouts?
We have to be careful. We have to be careful not to draw a false distinction between adult issues and student issues. If teachers can't be compensated at a level where they can afford to live and teach in the state, that's not just an adult issue, that's a student issue. If schools don't have adequate resources to provide textbooks to kids, that's not an adult issue, that's a student issue. If schools don't have adequate resources to offer science and social studies and art and music to all kids, not just the wealthiest kids, that's a student issue, not just an adult issue. So from my perspective, whether it's the teachers in Oklahoma or the teachers in West Virginia, I'm inspired by their demand that the state make an investment in public education. And we should all understand public schools are the future of our democracy. Right? So when folks, that's right. So we are unfortunately at this moment where there are folks who want to abandon public education. And you see that, you see the politics of that in these states that have systematically disinvested from their schools. I was talking to a friend who's a superintendent in Oklahoma who's so frustrated because she can't keep the teachers she recruits because they look across the border and see how much more they could make just to feed their families. Right? And so from my perspective, all of us have a responsibility to stand with the teachers who are demanding that we invest in public education.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I'm a graduate of the University of Maryland from the doctoral program in international education policy. I have less a question than a comment on some of the things that you raised in your talk. You mentioned the role of social media as changing the societal landscape. I've been doing some research on student movements in the US and in South Africa and looking at similarities and differences. And in the course of doing that research, I've been reading about social movements internationally. And social movements have benefited from social media because people can be mobilized very quickly, and many people can be mobilized very quickly. But the Occupy Wall Street movement fell apart because it wasn't followed with action, it wasn't grounded in action. And using social media doesn't allow for people to sit down with each other and to develop strategies for addressing the issues in their communities. So I think your point about action is so important, that it can't just be mobilizing people by social media. You have to have actions and you have to have strategies to address the problems in your community.
That's exactly right, and I think there's a central role that universities can play. I'll tell you, one amazing life experience I had was visiting with Marian Wright Edelman, who runs the Children's Defense Fund, with her Freedom Schools program. Now, what Children's Defense Fund does is they run summer programs grounded often in African American history and literature for young people of color, and they train college students to lead those freedom schools. And the way they do it is they bring all the young people down to Alex Haley's farm. You know, Alex Haley, co-author of the autobiography of Malcolm X, and of course responsible for Roots. Now, they go to Alex Haley's farm and they spend time learning about history, reading, discussing literature, reflecting. Right? And when I went to visit with the students there and with Miriam, what she talked about was that part of the history of the civil rights movement that is often forgotten is the work that folks in the civil rights movement did to prepare themselves for activism by reading, by reflecting, through prayer. Right? That nonviolence isn't something that you just see on TV or see on social media. Right? It is a discipline. And you see it in Dr. King's writings, right? You see the role of Gandhi in his writings. You see the role of all the history of Western philosophy played out in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, right? So there's a intellectual rigor to doing protests right that I think your question suggests, and that's a powerful role that universities can play, to have students read those powerful texts, to spend time reflecting so they can put their activism into context. Sagoon.
Dr. King, Segun Eubanks, University of Maryland. First, I got to say, just because you mentioned it, I was a student in the Freedom Schools and a participant of that great civic education. So I want to ask you this pretty specific question, I guess, as an educator. I really was reflecting on your call for students to give back in community service, particularly after graduation. And frankly, as a teacher educator, the first thing came to mind was Teach for America. And how very well Teach for America embraces the concept of service, but yet contradicts, for many of us, the concept of quality education and quality teaching, and how we can kind of take advantage of what Teach for America has offered, but to do it in a way that I think gives more powerful education to young people in urban communities.
Yeah, it's an important question. I think there's a powerful contribution that Teach for America has made by engaging a set of young people in the potential of being teachers that otherwise might not have thought about teaching as a career. But it is a fair critique that not enough Teach for America teachers stay in the profession long term. Now, the folks at Teach for America would point out that the percentage who stay long term has been growing over time, and that I think they would say today more than 60% of Teach for America alums are engaged in education in some form. They may be teachers, but they may also be involved in education nonprofits and so forth. I actually think, sort of like similar to the Howard question, there is the specific question of Teach for America, but then there's the broader question of teacher retention and the collective challenge that we face, that whether it's Teach for America or traditional teacher preparation programs, too many of the students we prepare to be teachers don't stay in the teaching profession, particularly in high-needs communities. And as you know, I mean, many high-needs schools and high-needs districts, you can see a 50% turnover rate of new teachers over the first 5 years of their career. We have to get much better at keeping people in teaching. One of the ways we do that is make sure people are fairly compensated, right, to the earlier question about Oklahoma and West Virginia. But then beyond that, what kind of community do we create for new teachers? Right? Is it a supportive community? I think about visiting Singapore. My wife is always quick to point out Singapore is not a perfect society by any means, and it is not. But in Singapore, everyone, political leaders, business leaders, military leaders, everyone will tell you teaching is the most important profession in the society. Right? And there's a commitment that when you pursue teacher preparation, the cost of your training is subsidized. And then once you enter teaching, there's induction support over the first few years of your career. You're closely mentored. There's a career ladder where as you become a master teacher, you can play a leadership role, mentoring other teachers, leading in your school, leading in a network of schools. You can even cycle in to the central education ministry and then back to your school. There's an intentionality about the teaching career that helps keep people. And so whether it's Teach for America or traditional teacher prep programs, I think we all have an obligation to work closely with school districts to figure out how we get much better at retaining teachers and particularly at retaining a diverse faculty in our schools and districts. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. King, thank you so much for your comments. Carrie Ann O'Meara here at University of Maryland. I wonder whether you think the narrative that's out there about higher ed as a private good as opposed to a public good in any way inhibits our ability to convince the public about how important we can be and are as enhancing civic skills, knowledge, and action, because the high cost of higher ed, high stakes admissions, seems to have the narrative that we are many other things besides contributing to civic society.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And this is not, part of why I talk about the history of the role of public higher education in particular, is that this notion that higher education is just a private good is a more recent development in our history, right? If you look back, all the way back to Jefferson, there was an understanding of the centrality of higher education to the national mission of a healthy democracy. Look, Pell Grants, which provide aid to low-income students to go to college, are at a 40-year low in the percentage of the cost of college they cover. You have increasingly, certainly in this administration, agenda that is about steering higher education dollars to for-profit colleges, that many of which have a horrible record in terms of providing educational opportunity to students. Many of them have painfully low graduation rates, leave students burdened with debt, no degree, and no real future. So yes, I think we have a larger cultural challenge, but I think our role as people who care about public higher ed has to be to not just play defense, but to really articulate what an alternative vision would look like. And for me, that is the notion that I believe we can achieve affordable education for all low and middle income folks, not just 2-year, but 4-year. It's doable. You see an increasing number of states doing that. And I think about the state of Tennessee. If you graduate from high school in Tennessee, you know you can go to 2 years of community college for free. It's a conservative Republican governor, conservative Republican legislature, but they understand the centrality of education to the future of the state. And they just expanded that program with Tennessee Reconnect to adults who have some credits and no degree. So they can come back and know they can come back to community college for free. So I do think there's a possibility of a bipartisan effort, maybe now in states, not so much at the federal level at the moment, but that will change if we all vote.
Good evening. Thank you for speaking with us tonight. My name is Terry Hines. I'm with NASPA, which is Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education. You've spoken very eloquently tonight about how we can engage our students in civic and democratic learning. I'm curious to know if you have advice for those of us as faculty and staff and administrators on our college campuses. There is increasing legislation being introduced at the state level that would muzzle college administrators from speaking on public policy issues of the day. Mm-hmm. Given the current administration, that could cover any number of things that we believe are vital to protect and to address equality gaps in our education system. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and advice on those.
Yeah, I'm worried about that. It's one of the reasons why folks have to pay attention to what's happening in state legislatures. Right, there's a tendency in American political discourse, you see it when you watch the news, right? Almost all of the discussion is about Congress. But you have state legislatures that are, in many states, engaged in systematic strategies to undermine the strength of our democracy. And I see that whether that's restricting the ability of faculty members to be advocates, whether it's restricting who gets to vote and when. I mean, think about what that means. If you think the only way you can win elections is to make sure fewer people participate, what does that say? Right? We have states now where even where you can register to vote is being systematically restricted so that certain communities are less likely to be able to vote, and then systematically restricting where you can vote, where polling places are, so that you are less likely to have access to voting. It's all part of the same broader strategy, I think, to undermine our democracy. But the challenge I would give back and ask certainly faculty here, but all across the country to take up, is to not only be loud activists on broad public policy issues, but be loud activists on campus for issues of equity. Right? What if every white faculty member stood up and said, hey, why aren't there more people of color on this faculty? right? What if every faculty member joined the students when they ask, why aren't there more Pell-eligible students on this campus? Right? You see this assault from the current administration on affirmative action, but you haven't seen the loud response of people saying, actually, the problem isn't that African American and Latino students are overrepresented on flagship campuses and elite campuses. They are dramatically underrepresented, and what are we doing about that? So I think one of the challenges, again, is that we not allow ourselves in this moment of challenge to only play defense. Right? That the goal is to stop a legislature from restricting the speech of faculty members, but rather that we have an offensive strategy of what is it that we should demand on our campuses and in our states.
Dr. King, thank you very much for being here. My name is Gloria Aparicio Blackwell. I'm in the Office of Community Engagement, and you are playing music to my ears, because that's basically what I do, where I go out in the community and connect and for addressing real issues. The challenge that I see today is this Census 2020. Because all what we do here is about resources, whether it's the government, whether it's the university, to take people out in the community, you have to invest. And sometimes the dollars are very tight in so many different directions. But I want to get your takes. How do we address the issue to count the people? And how do we address the issue that we're asking about citizenship? Not all citizens know all we can vote, but they have a voice and they have needs. So what do we do about that?
Well, two things. One is I think that the administration is going to lose in court on that issue. But we can't put all of our eggs in that basket, given what has happened to the courts over the last, certainly over the last year and a half. And so I think we also have to organize around elections. Elections have consequences. I mean, one of my frustrations about how we got to this moment, and this isn't just a partisan point, because many of the things that we're talking about tonight are values that are shared by both, that used to be shared by both parties, around democracy, around the kind of diverse society we would have. But what's happened is when folks don't participate, right, then elections have a different set of outcomes. I worry that some of the young people who I see protesting around an issue like Black Lives Matter, then you ask, did you vote in the election for city council or district attorney? And they say no, and you have to point out that those votes matter for the agenda, that the agenda isn't just about raising the issue, it's about changing who the decision makers are. And it's city councils who agree to police contracts, and it's city councils who decide whether or not the police contract has reasonable procedures in place when there's been a shooting to get to justice. Right? It's DAs who make decisions about who's charged with what, how bail is set, right? What kinds of sentences are given. Those are being negotiated by DAs every day. So you can't just protest, you got to be involved in changing election outcomes. You got to do both. And increasingly, I mean, I'm inspired by folks like Brittany Packnett and DeRay McKesson, leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, who also understand that it's not just about the protest, it is also about changing political outcomes. Yes, ma'am. I think we have time for these last two questions.
Great.
Yes, ma'am.
Great, Dr. King, thank you for being here. I'm Rebecca Bellinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Global Business here at the university, and I'm proud to say we are actually the only Title VI center here at the university. And you'll remember, and for the audience, that Title VI is a grant program funded by the Higher Education Act and is distributed by the Department of Education. And it provides funding for programming, language programming in higher education, as well as international business programs. And yet every year, Title VI and Fulbright Hays together on the chopping block. And the White House budget for the last 2 cycles has actually zeroed this out. Now, while I know you can't do anything about that, my question is this: where does the idea of global mindset, of foreign language skills, where does that play out in this conversation about civic education, as we are preparing our students not just to be citizens here of the US, but really citizens of the world?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's fundamental. Look, we need students to have a sense of understanding of geography, of global politics, of world history, right? So there's knowledge that students need. There's a set of skills, like language skills, like the ability to communicate across culture, the ability to listen and learn from others who are different from you. And there's a set of experiences that we should help students to have where they're exposed to diverse world cultures. Unfortunately, much like social studies education and civics education, we have seen investments in world languages reduced in school districts. We see this particularly in high needs rural communities, a real decline in the availability of language instruction. It is one place where I'm somewhat hopeful about the ability of technology to help create opportunities that might not otherwise be available. So the student in a small rural high school might be able to take Japanese, even though they wouldn't otherwise be able to because of the power of a blended learning context. But again, this goes to fundamental values. Are we a society that is drawing in or reaching out to the rest of the world? And what we have now is leadership who thinks the answer is to draw in, right? To reject and ignore the rest of the world. That's exactly backwards. One of the things that President Obama always talked about was the importance of our engagement with other countries and other cultures, right? We need more young people today to learn Arabic, for example, right? We'd be better off. That would advance our national interest to do that. And instead, we are walking away from the very investments that would make that possible. So this is a values choice, but this is on the ballot too. Right? This values choice is on the ballot. And so the question for all of us is, what are we going to do to make sure that the people who win elections, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, have a commitment to America as an active participant in global community? You see it on the climate change issue, right? The rest of the world, the entire rest of the world, right, realizes there's climate change, right? But yet we're saying we're going to step apart from the rest of the world, even as we see on a regular basis the consequences of climate change playing out across the country as well as the world.
Good evening, Dr. King. Thank you again for being here. I'm Jane Spence. I'm a graduate of University of Maryland's education program, the doctorate in school system leadership and policy studies, but I'm also here representing K-12 educators. I see some of my colleagues in the room. And the question I have is about the civic learning that you started with, and you mentioned misinterpretation of ESSA and other national standards, et cetera, as one of the culprits. And I would argue that it's not just a misinterpretation of the accountability, it's also that there's a lot. You are here representing civic learning, but there could be someone here tomorrow representing science, and you heard the question about foreign language, and I'm sure that there are many in the room who would represent the needs of English language learners and students with special ed. So I think that there's just a lot that needs to be integrated, and you talked about the need to address this in an interdisciplinary manner, and I wonder if there are any systemic things that we need to be thinking about instead of just saying that everything needs to be kind of merged at the classroom level. If there are any systemic things that you're thinking about K-12, or if there are any systemic things that you're thinking about in the collegiate realm.
Yeah. Well, a couple of, it's an important and haunting question, right? But part of what I wonder about is we never have that conversation about rich kids, right? When it comes to rich kids, we take as a given that they're going to have a well-rounded education. You never hear in a wealthy community people saying, oh, well, I think we're just going to eliminate art and music because we really got to prioritize English and math, right? In wealthy communities, what we say is we're going to do it all. We're going to make sure that they have art and music and that they have science and social studies. We're going to make sure they have school counselors, right? We found in the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey that we did at the department, there are 1.6 million kids who go to a school where there's a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. Right? That's a value statement. That's a values judgment we're making as a society. We're saying for those kids over there, they don't deserve a school counselor, right? And so part of the systemic solution, from my perspective, to make sure that we do for all kids what we would do for rich kids, is to stop separating kids by race and class and create school communities that are racially and socioeconomically diverse, right? And it's one of the reasons I live in Montgomery County, is because of the long history, at least on our side of the county, the long history to racial and socioeconomic integration in housing and in education, right? I always tell the story that my daughter goes to middle school that's about a quarter black, a quarter white, a quarter Latino, a quarter Asian. And her softball team came off the field, and I said, wow, I just love your school. Your softball team is like a Benetton ad. And my daughter said, oh, what's Benetton? Fair enough. It's a little dated reference. But we choose to live there in part because that is the diversity that we want our kids to experience in school. Now, it's not to say that you can't have a successful school that is made up of entirely students of color living in poverty. But we have to acknowledge that it is much harder to ensure student access to opportunity when we isolate kids by race and class. The reality of American political life is that resources in American political life today and have always followed white, middle class, and affluent kids. And so the premise behind Brown, 1954, right? We all celebrate the history, the powerful Brown decision, but yet we actually aren't fulfilling the promise of Brown. If you segregate by race and class, you are, in our American society, going to see less resources and less opportunity in those schools that are made up of concentrated poverty. You also have the phenomenon, and many of you live this in the schools where you work, when a teacher walks in a classroom and all 30 kids have experienced trauma, we have to acknowledge that that is more challenging. Right? So racial and socioeconomic integration in housing and education policy, to me, is part of the structural solution. I would also say equitable resources for schools, starting from the earliest ages. Right? Part of what high-need schools are struggling to do is to make up for the fact that kids are coming in kindergarten holding the book upside down because they haven't seen letters before. Or they're not familiar enough with letters. It shouldn't be that way. We can afford to invest in high-quality early learning for all kids so that all kids arrive at kindergarten ready, academically and socio-emotionally. That's a choice. That's a values choice. So integration, investment, all the way through early learning, through K-12, into higher education. And the last point, and maybe I'll end on this, is really a question of leadership. Right? What do we call the nation to? What do we call our state to? What do we call our community to? What vision for the future of all kids do we put forward? Right? And the vision we should put forward is one where all kids have access to a well-rounded education, where all kids have access to schools that are safe and supportive environments, where all kids have access to post-secondary opportunity, right? Where all kids have the experience of working with diverse peers and diverse educators. Right? That's the vision that we need expressed. And sadly today we have leaders that are presenting a very different vision. And again, the responsibility for all of us is, so what are we going to do about it? What action will each of us take? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your engagement. Thank you for not just throwing softballs at Dr. King and not holding back on the tough questions. I just want to thank Dr. King once more for his comments tonight and really for his call to action. I really took to heart that it's important to have the knowledge and the skills, but it's also important to take action. And so this was not just food for thought, but it was also food for action. And I hope we can all leave the room thinking about these big questions of who do we want to be and what can each of us do today, tomorrow, So that's what we need to be thinking about. So John, thank you again for your leadership in education, for providing us such a thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. I have a small token of our gratitude for you.
Thanks very much.
And thank you all for joining us tonight and for your engagement in these conversations. As I said, tonight was a beginning, but I look forward to having more of these in our lecture series on education and society. This concludes tonight's lecture, but we have a reception set up right outside the doors, so please come out, spend some time with John, with one another. Thank you very much for coming.